Around the edges of what is now southern Mexico City, a curious pattern of land and water persists. Neat rectangles of greenery float upon shallow canals, their mirror-like surfaces broken only by the gliding passage of narrow wooden boats. These are the last remnants of a vast Aztec innovation, Chinampas, or floating gardens, an ancient agricultural technology that once fed an empire. But the term floating is a misnomer. The gardens don't float at all. Rather, they are artificial islands, built with painstaking effort and constant maintenance. And they represent not just botanical ingenuity, but a way of life built on routine, repetition, and invisible labor, especially the labor of weeding. To understand the origins of the Chinampas, you must imagine the Valley of Mexico in the 14th century not as a city of concrete and traffic, but as a watery highland basin, cradling Lake Texcoco and its surrounding sister lakes. Marshlands teemed with birds. The air was damp, with volcanic soil silting the waters. But the Aztecs, or more accurately, their predecessors, the Xochimilco people, saw not just wetlands, but potential. Chinampas were born not from abundance, but necessity. Central Mexico's lakes weren't deep, but the population was growing. Fields on land were limited, so the Xochimilco began extending the land itself. They wove mats of reeds, anchored them with stakes, and piled them with layers of lake sediment, compost, and mud dredged from the bottom. Over time, these platforms hardened into fertile, root-soaked islands. Each Chinampa was roughly 30 meters long and 2.5 meters wide, a long, narrow garden plot surrounded by canals on three sides. Willows called ahujotes were planted at the corners to secure the structure with their roots, forming living pylons. Crops grew year-round in the soft, nutrient-rich soil, with the water moderating temperature extremes and providing irrigation. The success of the system was staggering. A single Chinampa could yield 7 harvests per year. Maize, beans, amaranth, squash, chilies, and tomatoes, plus herbs, flowers, and medicinal plants grew in dense, organized rows. There were no beasts of burden. All labor was human, and much of it was slow, methodical, repetitive. And among the most important of these tasks, weeding. The daily reality of Chinampa farming was far less glamorous than its engineering marvel. Yes, the ingenuity was immense, but so was the upkeep. The very fertility that made the islands so productive also made them perfect breeding grounds for weeds. Fast-growing, persistent, and invasive, these plants could choke out crops if not vigilantly removed. And unlike today's agriculture, no chemical herbicides existed, only hands, patience, and bent backs. Morning light would strike the misty canals, and farmers, often whole families, would begin their rounds. Rowing from one Chinampa to another, they'd step carefully along narrow, muddy paths between crops. With practiced movements, they'd pluck up weeds, not yanked too quickly, lest roots remain, but gently and fully, depositing them into wicker baskets to be composted. This process wasn't flashy, it wasn't violent, it wasn't commemorated in war poetry or carved into stone, but it was essential. Without constant weeding, the entire Chinampa system could collapse. The Aztecs knew this, and so did their neighbors. As their empire expanded, they adopted and adapted the Chinampa model throughout their realm. Xochimilco became the empire's green belt, supplying food to Tenochtitlan, the capital on the lake. Imagine Tenochtitlan in the early 1500s, a city of shimmering canals and grand temples, bustling with activity. Goods arrived daily from Chinampas via canoe piles of maize, baskets of chilies, armfuls of fragrant marigolds. And behind every canoe load of produce was a silent, unseen army of weed pullers. It is tempting, when viewing the remnants of these gardens today, to romanticize them. To imagine serene farmers in straw hats, humming to themselves as they drift between rows of maize. But this was not idle work. The Chinampas were industrial in their output and required a regimen closer to bureaucracy than pastoral bliss. Calendars were kept, crop rotations were planned, fields were rested in calculated cycles, weeding schedules were drawn up, sometimes enforced by temple authorities or village elders. To neglect your garden was not only lazy, it was a social offense, because everyone depended on the system working. Everyone. Even spiritual beliefs became entangled in the weeds. Certain invasive plants were thought to harbor Tlaloc minor rain spirits. If they were removed disrespectfully or at the wrong time, misfortune could follow. Some weeds were medicinal, others were fatal. The farmer had to know them all. So when we talk about the greatness of the Aztec Empire, should we think only of warriors and gold? Or should we spare a moment for the man knee-deep in lake mud, carefully plucking water hyssop from between bean plants? In this silent choreography of weeding, we see more than gardening, we see the maintenance of a civilization. But what happened when this balance was disrupted? What did conquest mean for such a delicate, labor-intensive system? The year was 1519 when Hernán Cortés and his band of Spanish soldiers stepped into the heart of Mesoamerica. They arrived, not just with steel and horses, but with unfamiliar ideas of property, warfare, and agriculture. What they found in the Valley of Mexico, particularly in the capital city of Tenochtitlan, was more alien than anything they had imagined. A city laced with water, floating gardens tilled by hand, and a dense network of canals that pulsed with the steady rhythm of trade and labor. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, rested on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, its heart nourished by the vast agricultural machine of the Chinampas surrounding it. The system was self-sustaining, hyper-local, and rooted in a balance between humans and environment. The Spanish, however, did not see the slow genius of it. They saw something strange, primitive, even childlike compared to their familiar European plows and livestock. When Cortés laid siege to the city in 1521, he did more than topple an empire. The military victory also disrupted an ecological and agricultural equilibrium that had taken centuries to build. The destruction of Tenochtitlan and its surroundings led to more than bloodshed, it led to the unraveling of the Chinampa system. At first, the gardens remained. The Spanish saw their productivity and made use of them, but they didn't understand the maintenance required. The weeding, the dredging, the replanting of ahujote trees at just the right time, the composting of night soil from city latrines into Chinampa plots. These weren't things you could command with a title of nobility or demand at sword point. They required continuity, memory, tradition. Worse still, disease took its toll. The smallpox epidemic that swept through the region after the conquest didn't just decimate warriors, it devastated the peasant farmers who tended the gardens. Thousands perished, leaving their plots untended. The weeds grew back thicker and faster than ever. Without hands to pluck them, canals silted up. Without knowledge to repair them, causeways collapsed. The Spanish began to introduce European crops, wheat, barley, fruit trees, and with them came European animals. Sheep and cattle roamed freely where once there had been orderly rows of maize and squash. The delicate balance of Chinampa agriculture couldn't withstand the hooves of grazing livestock. What had been a humming network of coordinated micro-farms became patchwork. Yet some Chinampas survived, not out of imperial policy but out of necessity. The Spanish, after all, needed food, and the indigenous people of Xochimilco, Mixquic, and Tlahuac adapted. They retained their knowledge, hidden behind forced conversions and colonial authorities. They continued weeding in silence. Over the decades, the Spanish built over the lakes. Drainage projects were initiated to make room for roads and churches, and eventually, entire lake beds were dried. The Valley of Mexico, once shimmering with water, was being drained into dust. The Chinampas, which had relied on water flow, began to struggle. Some were abandoned. Others clung to life, fed by smaller canal systems and by the perseverance of local communities. Yet even amid collapse, some things endured. We know this because colonial records begin to note complaints not about the loss of infrastructure, but about labor obligations. Spanish administrators attempting to levy taxes on indigenous populations, began encountering village councils who insisted that their time was already spent maintaining the gardens. The colonial bureaucracy, frustrated, documented the issue in elaborate tribute records and censuses. In them, we see glimpses of a system under pressure, but not yet broken. By the 1600s, some Spanish friars began to admire the Chinampa method. They wrote glowingly about the productivity of the gardens, with one chronicler noting that a single canoe could be filled daily from just one plot. But their admiration was tinged with misunderstanding. They still referred to it as floating and exotic, never quite grasping the labor ecology beneath it all. Meanwhile, the laborers themselves, the weeders, planters, and harvesters, were becoming invisible. Forced into encomiendas or pushed to the margins, they survived by adapting. They held on to old farming calendars under new Christian names. They carried out weeding in silence, as generations before them had, though now without the spiritual protections of the rain gods and lake spirits. But we must not mistake invisibility for absence. The persistence of the Chinampa system, even as the lakes drained and colonial violence persisted, is a testament to resilience. Weeding, a task so mundane that it rarely appears in the historical record, became an act of preservation, quiet resistance, cultural continuity. Yet by the 19th century, the erosion was undeniable. Mexico City's expansion, industrialization, and the drive toward modern infrastructure led to even more aggressive drainage projects. Railways crossed the former lake beds. The last connections between the Chinampa zones and the larger hydrological system of the valley were severed. Still, Xochimilco refused to vanish. It is here that the story becomes more complex. Even as Chinampas disappeared from other regions, Xochimilco remained, holding tight to its canals, preserving not just agriculture but culture. Families passed down techniques. Children were taught to identify weeds, when to pull them, when to leave them. Festivals celebrated the planting cycles. The gardens became heritage not in the romanticized tourist sense, but in the embodied knowledge of how to sustain life from silt, mud, and labor. And yet, what is the cost of remembering when the world forgets around you? What happens when the slow art of weeding collides with the fast pace of modernity? It is the 21st century, and Mexico City, sprawling, chaotic, and densely packed, sits atop the dry bones of the once glimmering Lake Texcoco. Millions of people traverse the cracked earth daily, commuting over ancient canals now hidden beneath asphalt and sewage lines. The air is often dry, the groundwater sinking, the city literally collapsing under its own weight due to centuries of drainage. And yet, in the far south of the metropolis, something ancient still breathes. In Xochimilco, a network of canals and Chinampas still survives, a mosaic of muddy greens and blues, surrounded by concrete sprawl. It's a ghost of what once was a fraction of the 22,000 hectares of Chinampas that fed the Aztec Empire, but it remains, not just as a cultural relic or as an echo of the past, but as a living, functional agricultural system. It is also still home to the same slow, silent art that sustained it for centuries: weeding. Here, farmers called Chinamperos rise before dawn. Their wooden trajineras, flat-bottomed boats, glide through narrow, overgrown canals. Some are painted in bright colors for tourists, but many are not. These are workboats, stacked with crates, seedlings, shovels, and baskets. On a good day, a Chinampero may weed for 5 or 6 hours, crouched among the rows of lettuce, radishes, or marigolds. Just like their ancestors, they use no herbicides. Their tools are hands, small blades, and memory. Weeds are pulled at the root, sorted for compost, or removed entirely depending on type. This is not guesswork. It is craft. Some Chinamperos know 40 or more local weed species by name. A few are tolerated or even encouraged because they help keep pests away or enrich the soil. Others are aggressively removed. Calendars are still used, some digital now, yes, but many based on older knowledge passed between generations. Certain moon phases are better for planting, and others for pulling roots. Weeding, once again, remains one of the most important tasks. But the pressures today are different. Chinamperos must now battle pollution, tourism, land grabs, and urban encroachment. Industrial and residential waste is dumped into canals. Invasive species like water hyacinth, introduced by well-meaning gardeners, now threaten to choke the waterways. The Mexican axolotl, once abundant in the clean water of Chinampa canals, is nearly extinct in the wild. Local governments have tried to help designating the area a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987, investing in ecological restoration and funding pilot programs. But enforcement is uneven and funding scarce. Tour operators crowd the canals with party boats and music, disrupting the delicate work of farming. And still Chinamperos persist. They innovate. Some use solar-powered pumps and floating greenhouses. Others are reviving ancient composting techniques, including the use of human-urnite soil composted under careful sanitary conditions, just as their ancestors did. Farmer cooperatives have formed to sell organic produce directly to restaurants and markets in the city. Educational Tour now invites students to pull their first weed, not just for novelty, but to teach what was almost lost. Still, the work is slow, backbreaking, humid, often lonely. A single Chinampa can require dozens of hours per week in maintenance. If you neglect it, the weeds will return. The soil compacts. The roots of the willows weaken. In 1 year, a garden can die. There are no monuments for the weeders, no statues, no parades, and yet they are the reason Xochimilco still exists. A city of nearly 22 million people surrounds them, unaware that this ancient system may still hold answers to modern problems. Why does it matter? After all, the Chinampas today feed only a small portion of the population. They cannot compete with industrial farms, genetically modified seeds, and global trade routes. But this is where history lingers. The Chinampa is not just a relic. It is a system of survival, of building abundance out of wetlands and waste, of sustaining life without fossil fuels or synthetic chemicals. In an era of ecological crisis and food insecurity, the floating gardens offer not just beauty, but viable, resilient techniques. And so the weeding continues. Not because it is glamorous, not because it is profitable, but because it is necessary. In that act, kneeling in the mud, pulling at roots that do not belong, we see the persistence of memory, the refusal to abandon a practice simply because the world has changed around it. This story of Chinampas is a reminder. History is not only preserved in temples and textbooks, it is preserved in muscle memory, in the tactile rhythm of pulling weeds, of planting seeds, of dredging mud from the lake bottom. It is preserved in silence, in boring, repetitive, vital acts. And maybe, just maybe, the slow art of weeding is exactly what the future needs, a way to return, not backwards but inward, back to the earth, back to water, back to care. How many other histories like this, built from mud, weeds, and human hands, are still waiting to be noticed beneath our modern feet? Before the hum of machines, before the roar of factories and the hiss of steam, there was the patient swish of scythes in fields of blue-flowered flax. In the medieval world, especially across northern Europe, linen wasn't just a textile. It was a process, a slow, labor-intensive, and deeply ingrained part of rural life, so ordinary that its complexity was often overlooked, even in its own time. But behind every linen shirt worn by a monk, every white altar cloth in a village church, and every sail straining on the wind across the North Sea, there was a journey that began not in a workshop or monastery, but in the soil. The flax plant and the European landscape. The plant itself, Linum usitatissimum, was surprisingly fragile despite its name, usitatissimum meaning most useful. It required particular conditions to thrive: moist, well-drained soil, cool climates, and long days of sunlight. It was grown extensively in Flanders, East Anglia, northern France, and later in Germanic territories and the Low Countries. To plant flax, One had to prepare the soil, meticulously smoothing the field by hand or with simple harrows pulled by oxen. Flax seed was sown in early spring and over weeks grew into tall, slender stalks with small, sky-colored flowers. There were no shortcuts. To achieve good fiber quality, flax had to be grown densely, making the stems long and straight. Once matured, usually about 100 days after planting, it was not harvested with a sickle. That would cut the stalks and shorten the fibers. Instead, the plants were pulled by hand, roots and all, often by women and children bent over in endless rows, working slowly and deliberately. The pulled flax was tied into bundles called beats, then left in the field to dry in the sun. At this point, it still looked like straw, stiff and unpromising, and the work had barely begun. Retting, rotting with purpose. Linen doesn't come easily. The fibers used for weaving are trapped inside the stalk's woody casing. To extract them, the plant had to go through retting, a controlled rotting process that sounds simple but could destroy a year's labor if mishandled. Retting could be done in stagnant pools, streams, or even damp meadows. The bundles were submerged under water and held down with stones or wooden grates. There, bacteria would break down the pectin that glued the fibers to the inner stalk. This took several days to weeks, depending on water temperature. And this is where patience was everything. Ret too little and the fibers wouldn't separate. Ret too long and the fibers would rot into mush. The smell was strong, foul, even comparable to fermenting algae and rotting vegetation. It clung to the workers, the village air, even the clothes hung nearby. In some towns, complaints about retting ponds appear in tax records and ecclesiastical complaints. It was necessary but deeply unpopular work, often pushed to the margins of settlements or given to the poorest workers. Once retted, the bundles were dried again, sometimes over wood fires, sometimes simply in the sun. The risk of mildew or re-wetting meant that linen production was at the mercy of the weather, and not all flax survived. Still, the effort was worth it. Linen was prized not only for clothing but for bandages, shrouds, writing parchment, and sailcloth. Even in the early medieval church, linen was considered pure, used to wrap relics and cover altars. The best linen, white, strong, smooth, was an indicator of wealth, but even poor peasants needed basic flax cloth for tunics and bed linens. Scutching, breaking, and hackling, the loud and the lonely tasks. After drying, the next stages of flax processing required not only labor but tools, and not many households had them all. So flax processing became a communal economy with tools borrowed, rented, or inherited. The first step was breaking the flax. Large wooden brakes, often simple hinged devices, were used to crush the woody stalks without harming the inner fibers. The worker would place a handful of stalks on the brake and slam the top board down rhythmically, shattering the outer core. This was dusty, loud work. Chips of stalk and dust filled the air, clogging lungs and leaving skin irritated. Gloves were rarely used. It was seasonal, done mostly in winter when field labor was quiet, and thus it filled the cold, damp workshops with sound. In some regions, women did this work communally, singing or chanting to pass the time, though many worked in silence, focused on not damaging the fibers. Next came scutching, scraping the stalks with a blunt wooden knife against a vertical board to remove the broken wood bits. It required rhythm, attention, and strength. And finally, hackling or combing. Rows of iron spikes like enormous brushes were used to pull the fibers into long, smooth threads. This separated the soft, lined fibers from the coarser tow. The line was used for fine cloth. Tow might go to sackcloth or rope. Hackling was tedious, but it was where the flax began to resemble thread. Women dominated these tasks. In many villages, a girl's skill in hackling could determine her marriage prospects, especially in Flanders and England. Her ability to produce smooth, evenly combed flax meant economic stability. Yet nowhere in the medieval archives is a hackler's name recorded with honor. They were anonymous hands in a long process, uncelebrated, invisible. The long wait for a loom. After all this work, months of field labor, weeks of retting, days of breaking and combing, the flax was finally ready for spinning. Only now could it be transformed into thread. But this was not the job of the same person. In many medieval communities, textile production was divided. A household might grow flax, but the spinning was done by spinners, often older women or widows who worked from home. Their products were sold at local markets or passed up the supply chain to merchants. Spinners used drop spindles or later simple spinning wheels. Each thread had to be drawn out, twisted, and wound carefully. The spinning of linen was slow, far slower than wool. Linen fibers are slicker, more brittle. They require a skilled hand. It could take 80 to 100 hours to spin enough thread for a single tunic. And after spinning came weaving. But before we explore the looms, guilds, and markets that emerged around the linen industry, we must ask, what happened when this deeply domestic, rural labor entered the urban world of organized trade? The year is 1250. In the towns of Ypres, Bruges, and Ghent, wooden shutters rattle open in the cool morning light. Narrow streets begin to fill with carts, laden with sacks of spun flax. On stoops and inside open doorways, looms creak to life. The air smells faintly of oil, dust, and damp wool, even though the textile today is not wool, but linen. The long, slow process of transforming flax into fiber is nearing its conclusion. The looms are where it happens. And as medieval Europe begins to shift from scattered rural households into concentrated market towns, the loom is more than just a tool, it is an engine of urbanization. But this stage of the linen process was also where power shifted from women to men, from countryside to city, from invisible labor to regulated craft. It is where control was formalized, names were recorded, and the value of cloth became not just utility, but currency. The rise of the linen weaver. Looms were not typically household furnishings. They were large, expensive, and required dedicated space. A vertical loom might be seen in more modest homes, but the dominant device in the towns of northern Europe by the 13th century was the horizontal treadle loom, operated primarily by men. These weavers were no longer simply farmers or part-time artisans. They were part of a growing professional class, organized into guilds, trained through apprenticeship, and governed by elaborate rules. In Flanders, for example, weaving guilds enforce standards of thread tension, pattern, and finish. A bolt of linen that failed inspection could be confiscated, destroyed, or heavily fined. These weren't just fussy requirements, they protected reputation and ensured trade routes remained open. You couldn't just decide to be a weaver. You had to train, often starting as an apprentice in your early teens. After several years, you might progress to journeyman and eventually master. Only masters could operate their own looms or take on apprentices, and all of this was meticulously documented in town records. It is one of the many ironies of linen production that while the early stages, planting, pulling, retting, scutching, hackling, spinning, were women's work, the final, most visible stage, weaving and selling, was male-dominated. In cities like Leiden, Erfurt, and Douai, weaving halls sprang up. Urban regulations required that looms be registered, that output be measured, and that linen sold at market bear official stamps. A bolt of cloth became a unit of economic measurement, like coin. Still, rural weavers existed, especially in poorer regions or isolated valleys. They worked quietly, often seasonally, away from guild control. Their products were humbler: rough linen, coarse fabrics used for underclothes, work tunics, or grain sacks. Their names, too, are largely lost. The fulling and finishing of fabric. Once woven, linen wasn't immediately usable. The fabric still carried oils from spinning, dust from weaving, and stiffness from the natural fibers. It needed to be finished or dressed. In urban centers, finishing became a specialized trade. Fabric was washed, pounded, and bleached often in open fields known as bleach greens. There, wet bolts were laid in the sun and periodically sprinkled with water or lye, sometimes urine. Sunlight worked as a slow bleach, gradually whitening the fabric over several weeks. In rainy regions, this was slow, seasonal work, but the result was dramatic: white linen, a mark of purity, wealth, and refinement. Some linens were dyed, but most were left white or off-white. Dyes were reserved for wool, as linen did not absorb color well. Instead, cleanliness and smoothness became the benchmarks of fine linen. After bleaching, the cloth was stretched, trimmed, and rolled. Bolts were then taken to cloth halls, where buyers both local and international inspected them. Here, finally, the value of months of labor was realized in coin. But few of those coins ever made their way back to the flax pullers, the Redding Pond tenders, or the women who spent hours hackling fibers in the cold. The hidden network of labor. If one were to walk through a medieval cloth hall, the bolts of linen would seem uniform, precise, standardized. But their journey was anything but. Each bolt was a record of hidden labor. A woman who risked illness standing waist-deep in icy water to retrieve retted bundles. A spinner who squinted by firelight to twist brittle fibers into usable thread. A child who gathered kindling to dry the flax, careful not to scorch it. A journeyman weaver whose foot movements were timed to the rhythm of his shuttle. A finisher who laid the cloth out, hour by hour, under a sky that might or might not cooperate. This was collective, generational work. Linen didn't happen in a day. A single sheet of fine linen might take a year or more to produce, from field to fabric. In rural parishes, church inventories often included a few linen garments passed down, mended, rewoven. Linen was tough. It resisted rot. It could be recycled into rags, then paper. Every scrap was used. Linen was not just worn, it was buried in. Wealthy nobles were wrapped in it. So were saints and criminals. Linen was used for bandages, for swaddling, for flags. And yet, when we read the chronicles of medieval Europe, linen is rarely mentioned unless it adorns a king or covers an altar. But the weeding still had to happen, the redding still stank, the scutching still blistered the hands. What then does it mean to build an economy on a material that depends so deeply on invisible labor? And what happens when that labor begins to vanish from memory, even as the cloth it produced is preserved in museums? The late medieval period crept into early modernity with slow but steady transformation. Trade grew, towns expanded, and linen, that pale, modest cloth spun from blue-flowered stalks, found itself at the center of change not by force, but by sheer usefulness. Yet as linen's reach expanded, the hands that had once nurtured it from seed to cloth began to disappear into the shadows of industrialization, market centralization, and shifting gender roles. The story of linen became a story of displacement. But even in the unraveling of this cottage-based system, the echo of generations of labor did not entirely vanish. It lingered in rags, in records, and in the silent endurance of the textile itself. The rise of commercial linen centers. By the 16th and 17th centuries, cities like Lübeck, Haarlem, and Leipzig had become major linen hubs. These weren't simply weaving towns, they were centers of export. Linen began traveling farther than ever before, to the Baltic, to England, and eventually across the Atlantic to colonial America. The cloth, still largely produced by smallholders and spinners, became an article of global trade. Ledgers in Dutch mercantile offices tracked bolts of white Holland cloth, shipped to Jamaica, Virginia, or Boston. Linen was even used as currency, a standardized, valued commodity on par with grain or silver in certain regions. Yet the system behind it still rested on rural women working seasonally and anonymously, increasingly under pressure. Spinners, once essential, now faced competition from mechanized mills. By the 18th century, spinning frames and early power looms in England began displacing hand labor. Wool was mechanized first, then cotton, but linen was not immune. Its production, especially the coarse types, began to centralize. As industries scaled, quality suffered. Where once linen fibers had been carefully hackled and spun, mass production brought shortcuts: mixed fibers, uneven bleaching, and thread that frayed sooner. Still, the demand grew. Linen cloth became accessible to those who had never worn it before. The poor, previously wrapped in coarse homespun, now had shirts. Hospitals and workhouses adopted linen sheets. The textile that had once signified ritual purity now clothed orphans and gravediggers. And yet woven into these changes was loss. The disappearance of local knowledge. The tools used to process flax breaks, hackles, scutching knives began to vanish from barns and outbuildings. Inheritance inventories from the 1600s that once listed 1 hackle and 12 pounds of flax no longer appeared by 1750. Redding ponds dried up. Flax fields were turned into pastures. Spinning songs once common in village lore faded from oral tradition. The communal weeding parties, the rhythmic scutching during long winter evenings, the ritual burning of flax dust to ward off rot, these were not recorded in official histories. They simply ceased to be. Historians have since struggled to reconstruct the everyday labor of flax women. What survives are fragments: a widow's will leaving 3 hanks of tow to a niece, a parish ledger noting payment for bleaching, a worn hackle in a museum case, misidentified as a wool carder. In this way, the very material of survival linen was separated from the people who made it. Yet linen itself endured. It is remarkably tough. Even today, archaeologists unearth scraps of medieval linen preserved in bogs, wrappings around relics, or in the linings of decayed garments. These threads speak not of grandeur but of use. From rags to paper, a new life for old cloth. And then came perhaps the most remarkable twist in linen's long journey. It became paper. By the 14th century in Europe, linen rags were already being recycled into handmade paper. The process was simple but ingenious. Clean the old cloth, soak it, beat it into pulp, and press it into sheets. The result was durable, smooth paper ideal for books, ledgers, and maps. The Gutenberg Bible, the earliest printed books, many Renaissance manuscripts, all printed on rag paper, made from discarded linen clothing and household textiles. Thus, the labor of anonymous women who grew, combed, and spun flax came to underpin the entire intellectual revolution of the early modern era. This was linen in its second life. The shirts and aprons worn by spinners became the substrate for sermons, scientific treatises, political pamphlets, and poetry. We rarely think of this. We remember the authors. We honor the inventors of the printing press. But the raw material, the rag cloth, was made by people who never learned to read, never owned the books they helped make possible. What remains today? Today, linen is marketed as luxury. We see it in high-end bedding, summer garments, designer fashion. The process has been mechanized, globalized, and branded. Flax is still grown, largely in northern France, Belgium, and China. But few now know how to pull it by hand, how to red it without ruining it, how to break and hackle with rhythm and care. In some rural museums, demonstrations are staged. Retired farmers show children how scutching was done. But these are echoes, not continuations. The deep, lived expertise transmitted by repetition, not instruction, is largely gone. And so we return to the linen garments preserved in churches, the bolts tucked into archives, the rags turned into pages. These are not just artifacts. They are records of unseen work, fossilized in fiber. It is easy to forget that a single sheet could represent hundreds of hours of labor across seasons, households, and generations. That the weeding mattered, that the redding had to be timed by smell, not clock, that women's hands made the threads that underwrote both the economy and the written word. So the next time you see linen wrinkled, pale, unassuming, ask yourself, what stories lie hidden in the folds of old fabric? What knowledge do we lose when we no longer remember how to pull a plant from the earth and spin it into something strong? In the vast, golden expanse of the Sahara Desert, far from palm groves and water wells, there once stood a city made entirely of salt. The walls, the homes, the markets, all built from thick blocks of pale, glistening rock salt, carved straight from the earth. This place was called Tagheza, and though now a crumbled ghost of history, it once stood as a node in one of West Africa's most essential and quietly transformative economies. Salt, mundane, granulated, ever-present, was once more than a seasoning. In West Africa, it was survival, currency, and symbol, and it was heavy. The story of salt in this region is not one of glamorous kings or swift conquests, but of long-distance hauling, sweat, and repetition. It is the story of porters, camels, and quiet endurance under a sun that never blinked. The land without salt. To understand the salt economy, one must first understand its geography. Large portions of the West African Sahel and forest zones, modern-day Mali, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Guinea, lacked native salt deposits. While the people of these lands could grow millet, sorghum, and raise livestock, salt was scarce. Yet it was essential for preserving food, maintaining health, and meeting religious and cultural needs. Salt was especially vital in hot climates, where sweat leached minerals from the body faster than they could be replaced. By contrast, the Sahara Desert, though arid and unforgiving, had salt in abundance, especially in locations like Tagheza, Taoudeni, and Bilma. But mining it meant venturing deep into one of the harshest environments on Earth. And so caravans were born. Not casual trade caravans, but engineered logistical chains that stretched over 1,000 miles. These were organized, timed, and often state-sponsored. Caravans were operated by Berber or Tuareg traders from the desert edge and connected cities like Timbuktu, Walata, and Jen to distant salt mines. Each year, hundreds, sometimes thousands of camels formed long, silent lines across the dunes. The caravans moved like slow, breathing organisms. They were carefully spaced, each camel tied to the next, each load calculated. Their burden, not spices, not silk, not gold, but blocks of raw salt, each weighing roughly 30 to 40 kilograms. Each camel carried 4 to 6 slabs, lashed tightly on either side. The journey could take weeks, even months. Days were scorching, nights freezing. Sandstorms were common, and yet every year the caravans moved. Because without salt, towns would starve. Mining the white gold, labor in Tagheza. Tagheza was a settlement in what is now northern Mali, situated in a salt plain as flat and dry as any on Earth. There was no arable land, no trees, little water. The only reason anyone lived there was salt. The workers of Tagheza were often enslaved or indentured laborers, sent by their masters or empires, particularly the Songhai Empire, to dig the salt out of the earth. Their job was simple, dangerous, and mind-numbing. First, workers would remove the thin crust of surface sand. Below lay compacted salt layers, as much as 6 feet deep. Using simple tools, wooden levers, crude iron picks, they would carve the salt into slabs, shape them with axes, and stack them into blocks for drying. There was no shade. The heat reflecting off the salt burned the eyes. Water had to be brought in on camelback, often from wells dozens of kilometers away. Food was dry millet, salted for preservation. Living quarters were crude huts, also made from salt blocks that baked under the sun. Despite these hardships, production continued year after year. Why? Because the salt was profitable, even more than gold in some instances. Contemporary sources often remark, salt was traded for its weight in gold. And in some years, that was literally true. Trade without roads, the logic of the salt routes. From Tagheza, the salt was moved south. Caravans organized by North African merchants or local rulers brought salt to Timbuktu, the great intellectual and commercial hub. From there, it was redistributed some east to Gao, some west to Wagadu, some far south toward the forest kingdoms. Unlike Roman roads or Chinese trade networks, these routes left few visible marks. The Sahara shifts constantly, burying footprints and camel dung under waves of sand. Navigation was done by stars, dune shapes, and oral memory. And yet, the trade persisted for centuries, fluid, rhythmic, and efficient, relying entirely on oral contracts, trust networks, and kinship systems. At market towns, salt was exchanged for gold, kola nuts, ivory, textiles, and slaves. The blocks of salt were often broken down, ground, and resold in smaller pieces. For people living in regions far from the mines, a handful of salt could cost weeks of wages. But the wealth of kings and merchants masked the labor of movement. For every slab of salt brought to market, there were camels that had walked 1,000 miles, porters who had loaded and unloaded hundreds of kilos daily, miners who had worked with blistered hands under a brutal sun, guides who memorized the shape of shifting dunes, women who ground and packaged the salt in home villages, readying it for resale. This was history without architecture, a civilization of logistics, built not from monuments but from memory and motion. Timbuktu and the ledger of the invisible. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu had grown rich. Its scholars wrote books, its markets bustled, and its mosques like the famous Jingreber Mosque stood as symbols of wealth and piety. And yet, one of its core industries was still salt. Merchants tracked salt prices in written ledgers. Some were literate in Arabic, others kept oral account books, memorized and repeated daily. Entire merchant families built their fortunes on managing the caravan cycles, timing them to avoid the worst of the hot season, calculating risk of theft or drought. Salt was stored in warehouses, stacked in careful rows. Guards were hired, taxes were levied. Local rulers often claimed a fifth of the salt as duty. Despite this systemization, the laborers, those who actually mined, loaded, and hauled the salt, remained unrecorded. They appear only when things go wrong, when a caravan is lost, when a rebellion disrupts trade, when famine strikes a salt mining camp. But their efforts, like the salt itself, were foundational. Without them, nothing moved. So what happened when this ancient system, based on movement and sweat, began to fade? What forces disrupted the rhythms of salt and sand that had endured for centuries? By the mid-15th century, salt was no longer just a regional necessity in West Africa, it was a geopolitical asset. Its demand reached far beyond households and village markets, pulling in kings, merchants, and warriors. The white slabs from Taghaza were no longer just blocks for food preservation. They were weapons of statecraft, bargaining chips, and measures of wealth. And at the center of this salt-dusted network stood the great Songhai Empire, whose rulers understood something critical. Controlling salt meant controlling everything. But as control tightened, so too did labor. Salt, like so many critical resources in history, was increasingly obtained not through voluntary effort, but through coerced systems, enslavement, tribute, and taxation. The power of salt was growing, but so was the weight of its burden, especially on those whose names history would not record. The Songhai strategy. Under rulers like Sunni Ali, R 1464-1492, and Askia Muhammad, R 1493-1528, the Songhai Empire expanded across the Sahel, conquering and integrating cities such as Timbuktu, Gao, and Jen. These weren't just territorial conquests, they were nodes in a logistical system powered by salt and gold. Askia Muhammad, a devout Muslim and shrewd administrator, recognized that control of Taghaza deep in the desert was vital. It wasn't just a mine, it was a choke point in the trans-Saharan trade. Whoever governed Taghaza could determine who had access to salt, how much was taxed, and how it flowed into the southern markets. The salt blocks, once cut and dried, were taxed at multiple points. At the mine, where imperial officials collected tribute in salt or enforced quotas on laborers. Along the caravan route, where tribal leaders or local authorities demanded tolls. At the market cities, where incoming salt was recorded, weighed, and taxed again before sale. This chain of collection made salt both a resource and a ledger, a moving currency that helped fund the empire's bureaucracy, army, and infrastructure. But it was also fragile. The supply chain stretched over 1,000 kilometers through harsh terrain, hostile tribes, and unpredictable weather. Any disruption, rebellion, drought, or plague could lead to immediate salt shortages, which in turn could weaken the state's grip. Salt, then, was not just economic, it was political stability in crystallized form. Who carried the weight? The logistics of the salt trade required far more than camels and coin. It required people to mine, load, guard, guide, and deliver. And increasingly, those people were enslaved. The Songhai Empire, like its predecessors, Ghana and Mali, practiced slavery not as an incidental feature, but as an integrated part of economic production. Enslaved individuals were not only farmhands or concubines, they were also used in salt extraction and caravan labor. In places like Taghaza, enslaved laborers worked under the harshest possible conditions. There are reports from North African travelers, including the famed scholar Leo Africanus, describing salt workers living in crude huts of salt bricks, toiling under brutal heat with bare hands and no escape. The risk of injury, illness, and death was constant. The owners of these laborers were often state officials, nobles, or trading houses. Workers might spend years in the desert, their lives exchanged for quotas of white stone. Few returned. Fewer still left records. Even those who were not enslaved faced difficult lives. Porters carried heavy salt slabs on foot, sometimes for short local deliveries, other times across grueling terrains before they reached the main caravan hubs. Their pay, often a fraction of a salt slab or a day's worth of millet. There were guides, 2 navigators who knew the sands by heart. Their knowledge was priceless, yet they lived modestly, without titles, barely mentioned in chronicles except when a caravan got lost and someone needed to be blamed. What made the system work, then, was not just trade routes, it was silent coordination, generational knowledge, and exhausting labor. Salt and the city, Timbuktu's twin lives. Timbuktu, at the southern edge of the Sahara, was a paradox. To some, it was a city of scholars and books, home to universities and thousands of manuscripts, a beacon of Islamic learning. To others, it was a warehouse where salt met gold and numbers mattered more than theology. In the dry season, Timbuktu swelled with activity. Caravans arrived from the north, their camels caked in salt dust. Markets were packed. Merchants bargained in Arabic, Soninke, Fulani, and Tamashek. Slabs of salt were stacked like logs, counted, compared, and taxed. Some were stored in open yards, covered only with mats. Others were broken down, weighed into standard measures. Salt was currency. In fact, in some parts of West Africa, salt was literally used as money, shaved, measured, and traded in daily transactions. In villages far from the desert, a chunk of salt could buy tools, cloth, or livestock. Its value came not just from scarcity but from effort. Every slab of salt represented weeks of mining, loading, and walking. It had sweat value. This dual identity of Timbuktu's spiritual center and logistical depot highlights the interwoven nature of intellect and trade in West Africa. Books were written and sold alongside salt. Debates took place in the shade of warehouses. Pilgrims and porters crossed paths. And underpinning it all was the continued flow of salt. What disrupted the flow? Despite its stability, the salt system was not eternal. By the 17th century, a series of disruptions began to fray its threads. Moroccan invasion in 1591. The Moroccan Sultan sent an army south, armed with firearms, and crushed the Songhai army at the Battle of Tondibai. In the chaos that followed, imperial control of Taghaza and the salt trade collapsed. Internal revolts and power struggles fractured caravan routes. Trade became riskier. Climate shifts, mini droughts, and advancing desertification made the Sahara routes even more treacherous. European coastal trade rose in influence. The Portuguese and Dutch brought sea salt and other goods directly to the coast, bypassing the desert routes entirely. The once thriving caravan networks dwindled. The mines of Taghaza fell silent. The porters and guides dispersed. But the need for salt never ended. Which begs the question, what happens to a civilization when the arteries that fed it dry up, grain by grain, under the weight of shifting sands and changing priorities? By the 18th century, the long camel trains that once stitched the Sahara together like thread through fabric had begun to thin. The salt roads, those vast, invisible highways stretching across dunes and time, were no longer pulsing with the same regular rhythm. The white blocks still traveled, yes, but less often. Slower. Fewer hands moved them. Fewer mouths called out into the desert wind. Salt's era as the silent pillar of West African civilization was ending. Not abruptly, not with a collapse or explosion, but with the slow, quiet erosion that comes when value shifts elsewhere. Still, the legacy of this ancient trade would not simply vanish. It lingers in dialects, in customs, in crumbling salt huts, and in the physical memory of routes once memorized by heart. Coastal salt and the rise of Atlantic trade. While the desert continued to offer salt, it now had competition, one that didn't rely on the frail human chain of labor and memory. By the 1600s and into the 1700s, European ships, especially Portuguese, Dutch, and English, were anchoring along the West African coast, bringing not only guns, cloth, and iron bars, but salt, specifically sea salt, evaporated in large coastal pans in Portugal and France. This salt was cheaper to obtain, required less labor to mine, and was available year-round. While it lacked the dense mineral richness of Saharan salt, it served the same functions, preserving food, supplementing diets, curing fish. Most importantly, it was available at the very ports where European goods arrived. For coastal kingdoms such as the Asante, the Yoruba states, or the Benin Empire, it became easier to purchase salt with European goods than to organize a 1,000-mile desert caravan. Over time, the salt slabs of Taghaza and Taoudeni became less common in the forest zones. The trade routes remained, but they were quieter, emptier, their stations slowly abandoned. Still, for some inland regions, Saharan salt continued to hold cultural and spiritual significance. In certain communities, desert salt was still considered superior, purer, and more sacred. Ceremonies were conducted with it. Dowries still included slabs. Healers preferred it for poultices. But commerce rarely respects sentiment for long. The persistence of Taoudeni. While Taghaza faded into ruin, a new center emerged deeper in the desert, Taoudeni. Located in what is today northern Mali, this site inherited the mining legacy of Taghaza. By the 20th century, Taoudeni was producing tens of thousands of tons of salt annually, using methods not much changed from the 14th century. The labor still harsh, still manual, still backbreaking. Salt miners, many of them working under conditions that resembled penal servitude, chiseled blocks from the earth and stacked them for transport. Camels, and later trucks, carried them south to Timbuktu. The Azalai, the traditional salt caravans of the Tuareg, still operated into the late 1900s. These caravans moved slowly across the desert, echoing ancient rhythms. The sight of hundreds of camels, each bearing salt slabs and walking in single file, was something that had not changed in centuries. And yet fewer and fewer people lived this way. The logistical world had moved on. Where once salt controlled empires, now it competed with plastic-bagged iodized granules sold in corner stores, imported from China or India. The mineral that had once been currency, burden, gift, and grave marker was now commodity. Salt as culture, what endures? Despite the industrialization of salt and the decline of the trans-Saharan trade, salt's cultural weight in West Africa remains. In some areas, a gift of salt still marks respect and hospitality. Salt is included in naming ceremonies, marriages, and funerals. It is used in ritual purification, often thrown into fire or water to cleanse a space. Some communities still keep a ceremonial salt slab, chipped away slowly over years, used only for sacred occasions. In markets from Ouagadougou to Kano, blocks of raw desert salt are still sold, some more for tradition than necessity. Old salt routes have become footpaths, motorbike tracks, or myths. Some are remembered only in proverbs or half-sung caravan songs. A few are being retraced by modern historians and travelers, eager to recover what has nearly faded. And the labor, the porters, guides, loaders, and miners. Their names are mostly gone, but their muscle memory shaped the economy of a continent for centuries. Their quiet endurance built the pathways that gold, ideas, and even religion traveled along. Without them, there would have been no Timbuktu as we know it, no flourishing of Saharan commerce, no great manuscripts written on camel-funded parchment. They were never kings, they signed no treaties, they built no monuments, but they carried history literally on their backs. What is the memory of salt? Perhaps what makes salt so profound in history is its dual identity. It is common and overlooked, but it is also essential, invisible, and deeply tied to human need. Salt preserves, heals, and seasons, but it also erodes, dissolves, and disappears, just like the histories it carried. And so we end this story not with a battle, a coronation, or a grand proclamation, but with the imagined sound of camel bells in the distance, the crunch of footsteps on a desert crust, and a single white slab, heavy, rectangular, and quiet. How many other seemingly mundane materials have shaped entire civilizations, and how often do we fail to see the hands that moved them? When people speak of Rome, they often conjure images of marble statues, triumphant legions, or grand amphitheaters. But beneath all of that, both literally and metaphorically, lay the roads. Ancient Rome's expansion, administration, and cultural diffusion were built not only on military strategy but on stone, gravel, and stubborn labor. The Roman road network, stretching more than 400,000 kilometers at its peak, about 80,000 of those paved, was perhaps the most durable and understated infrastructure achievement of the ancient world. It was not only built for conquest, but for logistics, communication, bureaucracy, and identity. But if the glory is often in the building, the real story lies in the maintenance, in the scraping, patching, surveying, and record-keeping. This is not the tale of an empire marching forth. This is the tale of what happens after the marching ends and the stones start to sink into the mud. The Via Appia, beginning with purpose. The year was 312 BCE when the censor Appius Claudius Caecus commissioned the first major Roman road, the Via Appia, stretching from Rome to Capua and eventually to Brundisium, modern Brindisi. This was no humble trail, it was a political statement in basalt. The road was laid with layered technique, a bottom foundation of stones, then gravel, then compacted sand, and finally polygonal stone slabs fitted with such precision that many sections are still visible today. The intent was clear: speed and permanence. Roman legions could now move swiftly, not sloshing through muddy paths but marching on engineered causeways. Goods followed. Messages followed. Soon, towns along the route gained markets, baths, even Roman citizenship. The road was the empire itself, extended in stone. Beyond conquest, roads as routine. Once the initial wave of road building was complete, the more mundane but crucial work began: road maintenance. The problem was not in construction. Romans had mastered that. The problem was time: weather, weeds, erosion, cart wheels carving ruts, spring floods washing out sections, cities that expanded or shrank, leaving roads misaligned with modern traffic. To handle this, the Romans developed a bureaucratic structure as complex as the roads themselves. The curators viarum were magistrates appointed to supervise road upkeep. They were often assisted by road surveyors, mensors, and engineers architecti. Labor was drawn from local towns, sometimes forced, sometimes paid, sometimes symbolic, a marker of municipal pride. One inscription from Gaul commemorates the paving of a single mile by a wealthy merchant, proudly noting the removal of weeds and leveling of potholes. Not exactly the stuff of epic poetry, but deeply Roman in its obsession with order. The muddy problem of maintenance. For all their grandeur, Roman roads faced a practical issue: water. Drainage was a constant battle. Roads were built with sloped centers cambering to shed rainwater, and side ditches were dug to redirect flow. But ditches clogged. Erosion undercut the sides, and in lowland regions or during winter thaws, entire roadbeds turned to sludge. Inscriptions and letters survive from provincial governors complaining of impassable roads, with one Gallic report noting that a section of the Via Agrippa had sunk half a man's height into the mire. The response: a mix of grumbling, taxation, and labor quotas. Cities were responsible for roads in their jurisdiction. If a stretch of road fell into disrepair, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a sign of neglect. Governors could fine towns, censure officials, or withhold funding. This created a culture where road work became public performance. Inscriptions often credited specific officials for renewing a mile, stabilizing a bridge, or straightening a junction. These were not grand acts, but they were seen as civil virtues: the maintenance of order, loyalty to the republic or emperor, and care for the collective. Milestones and meters, the Roman data habit. Another understated feature of Roman roads was their obsession with measurement. Along every major road stood milestones, milarium, stone markers placed at regular intervals, often every 1,000 paces, or roughly 1.48 km. These listed the distance to the nearest city, the name of the builder or restorer, and occasionally the reigning emperor. It was, in effect, a networked map, publicly updated, a kind of analog infrastructure report. Some milestones recorded resurveys. Others included imperial propaganda, such as, restored by decree of the Senate under the divine Hadrian. This mixture of data, authority, and civic pride created a culture of accountability. Roads were watched, not just traveled. Invisible labor: who actually built the roads? In Rome's grand narratives, the roads appear fully formed, created by decree. But the hands that laid the gravel, shaped the stone, dug the ditches, these belonged to soldiers, slaves, and day laborers. Legions often built roads during peacetime. It was a form of discipline, busy work, and strategy. A road meant faster deployment later. Slaves, particularly in the provinces, did much of the hard labor hauling stone, breaking earth, cutting drainage. Local communities contributed manpower, sometimes as taxes in kind. Few of these workers were named. No statue honors the soldier who spent a summer building a causeway in rainy Britannia. No song remembers the Gallic slave who placed the keystone of a bridge. But without them, the empire would have been immobile. Roads to nowhere. Not all Roman roads were triumphs. Some ended in towns that declined or vanished. Some were misaligned with geography, rising and falling with unnecessary elevation. Others were so ambitious they were never completed monuments to overreach. And yet even these failures remained visible, etched into the land. A farmer in 5th century Hispania might still plow around a half-paved Roman road, unsure of its purpose but unable to erase it. The empire shrank, collapsed, fragmented, but the roads worn, cracked, weed-choked endured. Which raises the question: were the Roman roads a symbol of empire, or of the slow inevitability of entropy? The glory of the Roman road was not in its pristine construction, but in the unending struggle to keep it from disappearing. By the time the empire reached its greatest extent, stretching from the moors of Britain to the banks of the Euphrates, Roman roads had become an inherited problem. Every mile built in one generation became a mile to repair in the next. Maintenance was relentless, repetitive, and quietly exhausting. This section is not about heroic expansion. It is about municipal budgets, crumbling stones, and the quiet triumphs and failures of those trying to keep the arteries of empire unclogged. The problem of distance. The farther a road was from Rome, the more vulnerable it became not to barbarians, but to neglect. In provinces like Britannia, Dacia, or Mauritania, roads were often built for military utility. Once the threat was subdued, or once the legions were redeployed, upkeep fell to local authorities who were underfunded, undertrained, or uninterested. Road decay began slowly. Drainage ditches filled with debris. Stones shifted or sank in freeze-thaw cycles. Grass grew through the seams. In mountain areas, rockslides buried paths. In river valleys, floods washed them out. There were attempts to address this. Governors sent inspectors, who in turn sent complaints to Rome or to regional capitals. But as the empire expanded, such communications became slower, funds became tighter, and priorities shifted. In a letter from the 3rd century, an administrator in Gaul remarks that the road to Lugdunum has become unusable for carts, and the villagers avoid it entirely. His request for aid went unanswered. He later funded minor repairs from his own estate. This happened often. Private funds and local initiatives replaced imperial ones. Roads became patchwork, one section smooth and maintained, the next a rut-filled track. The dream of universal infrastructure fractured under the weight of sheer geography. Road work as civic duty and punishment. In the late empire, the Roman state increasingly offloaded responsibility for roads onto local governments and wealthy landowners. The curial city council members were required to maintain roads in their jurisdiction, often at personal cost. What began as civic honor turned into financial liability. Many curials tried to avoid office, leading to a system where men were forcibly appointed to municipal posts they didn't want. Road maintenance became not just a duty, but a burden. For those lower on the social ladder, road work became punishment. Criminals, enslaved people, and prisoners of war were often sentenced to manual labor repairing roads, bridges, or mile markers. One tombstone from North Africa mentions a man who died during labor on the 4th mile of the Via Traiana, a hint that this work could be deadly, or at least degrading. And yet, without this labor, the system crumbled. Maintenance manuals and imperial mandates. The empire tried to regulate maintenance with edicts and manuals. Under emperors like Hadrian and Diocletian, officials compiled lists of required duties, standard road widths, and methods of stone cutting. One surviving excerpt from a road inspector's handbook describes how to test the level of a roadbed with a stretched cord, and how often ditches must be cleared. Not more than 3 winters may pass between cleanings. But these documents were often ignored. As central control weakened, local regions developed their own standards or abandoned standards entirely. In some cases, old Roman roads were cannibalized for building material. Basalt paving stones became foundation blocks for homes or walls or even sarcophagi. One official in Hispania, writing in the 5th century, notes that the village council of Osca has quarried the imperial road for paving their forum. He was ignored. Thus progress devoured itself. Changing traffic, changing needs. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the nature of movement was changing. Roman legions were fewer and less mobile. Trade routes had shifted to river transport, where barges could carry heavier loads more easily than carts on worn roads. Urban decline meant that once busy cities now had roads leading to abandoned markets or ruined forums. This led to an odd phenomenon: beautifully preserved sections of road that went nowhere. A traveler in Gaul might find a 2-mile stretch of the Via Agrippa still intact, flanked by milestones and lined with ditches, only to discover it ended in a bramble-covered field. For many, the road was no longer a link between centers, it was a local feature, repurposed for grazing, walking, or seasonal use. And yet, even in this reduced form, the roads persisted. They were too solid to vanish, and too inconvenient to remove. Roads as symbols in a fading empire. In the twilight of the Western Roman Empire, roads became cultural relics as much as functional tools. In literature, roads were used as metaphors for lost order, abandoned duty, and imperial decay. In sermons, Christian bishops spoke of the straight path as both literal and spiritual, drawing imagery from the once pristine roads of the Republic. In artwork, old roads appeared as thresholds, places where civilization once moved, but now stood still. Even as barbarian kingdoms took root, Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, they often reused Roman roads. Some were patched, renamed, or redirected, but the basic layout remained. And so the question arises: if a road no longer leads to a capital, or a forum, or a purpose, what does it become? Is it a monument, a scar, or merely a reminder that every empire must, at some point, maintain more than it can build? By the time the last Western Roman emperor was deposed in 476 CE, the road system that had once linked the empire's heart to its furthest edges was cracked, scavenged, overgrown, and still largely intact. Even in ruin, the roads endured. They were not preserved by reverence or by organized effort, but simply because they had been built too well to vanish. This final section is about what happened to those roads when no one was left to record their purpose, and how their quiet presence continued to shape Europe for centuries beyond the fall of Rome. From empire to patchwork, roads in the post-Roman world. As the Western Roman Empire fragmented into successor kingdoms, its infrastructure splintered too. The Franks, Visigoths, and Ostrogoths inherited roads they did not fully understand. These groups maintained some stretches, especially those near key cities or borderlands, but they had no centralized maintenance systems like the old curators' viarum. Roads were repaired when needed, and only if useful. In other cases, they were avoided. Roman roads, straight and uncompromising, often cut through lands now claimed by different rulers or tribal groups. Their directness, once their greatest strength, became a liability in a fractured landscape. Still, they were used. Pilgrims traveled on them. Messengers chose them. Soldiers followed them into new campaigns, even if they no longer led to Rome. Over time, they faded into habit, the lines people took because they had always taken them. No one remembered who had laid the stones, but the grooves remained. Ghost roads and folklore. In the rural imagination of post-Roman Europe, abandoned roads took on mythic qualities. In Gaul and Britain, villagers spoke of the old straight roads used by ancient kings. In Italy, ruined bridges and causeways became known as devil's roads, as their design seemed too precise for human hands. Some believed the roads had once been used by giants, or by spirits who moved faster than mortal men. These stories, though fanciful, point to a deeper truth. That old infrastructure becomes strange when its purpose is forgotten, but its form remains. Weeds might grow between the stones. Sheep might graze beside collapsed culverts. But even a ruined road carries a trace of direction, a sense of intentionality that never fully disappears. Roads as foundations, literally. By the Middle Ages, many Roman roads had been absorbed into new settlements. In towns like York, Cologne, and Lyon, the medieval streets followed the old Roman grid. Farmers reused roadbeds as boundaries between fields. Builders lifted stones from roads to build churches, barns, and city walls. Some roads were buried beneath new paving. Others became the foundations of cathedrals or monasteries. In more than one case, Roman milestones were repurposed as cornerstones or even grave markers. Roads had become raw material recycled not just physically, but conceptually. The idea that paths should connect cities, that roads must be maintained, that infrastructure matters, these were not lost, only quietly inherited. The return of the surveyors. It wasn't until the Renaissance and early modern period that Europe began to re-examine the Roman roads with purpose. Travelers and antiquarians traced their paths. Maps began to record ancient routes. In Britain, for example, John Ogilby's 17th-century atlas charted many Roman roads still in use, some nearly unchanged since the 1st century. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as nations built modern highways and railways, they often followed Roman routes. Why? Because the Romans had already done the hard work of finding the most stable, direct, and sensible ways through the landscape. Even today, highways in Italy, Spain, and France still follow the rough paths of Via Flaminia, Via Augusta, and Via Domitia. The ancient roads, once maintained by slaves, soldiers, and provincial magistrates, became the skeleton on which modern Europe was laid. Stones in the soil, what remains today? What survives of Roman roads today? Visible sections, preserved by archaeologists or by sheer accident. Stone bridges, still carrying foot traffic or narrow vehicles. Sunken paths, where centuries of wear have carved deep ruts. And in places, perfectly aligned straightaways, now used by tractors or hikers. But the most enduring part may be conceptual. The Roman road stands as a metaphor not for conquest, but for continuity through decay. It is about what happens when an idea is embedded not in a scroll or a temple, but in the ground, literally walked into the earth. It reminds us that history is not always about glory or collapse. Sometimes it is about drainage ditches, mud maintenance, and the unacknowledged people who keep the world from falling apart. Final reflections, walking a road that was never yours. Consider this. The next time you step onto a narrow European road, hemmed in by stone, strangely straight in a curving world, you may be walking where a Roman soldier once marched, or where a provincial farmer once pushed a cart of olives. You may be stepping on a system that once connected an empire. And you may also be standing atop the labor of people whose names were never recorded, who weeded the shoulders, who cleared the culverts, who lifted stones in the rain. Their story is not dramatic, but it is durable. How many modern systems, digital, physical, civic, will last 2,000 years because someone cared enough to maintain them? In the Western imagination, ancient China is often envisioned through sweeping dynasties, terracotta armies, silk-robed emperors, and towering pagodas. But behind the legends, behind the courts and military campaigns, the true machinery of empire was far quieter. It was the steady scratch of a brush against bamboo, the slow drip of ink into paper, and the endless labor of copying, sorting, and filing. For all its cultural majesty and military might, the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, was held together not by force alone, but by bureaucrats, educated men whose daily work was not war or worship, but paperwork. Thousands of them, filling in reports, logging grain yields, issuing permits, tracking the movement of oxen and criminals alike. This is their story, not of emperors and eunuchs, but but of the clerks, scribes, and low-level administrators who quietly ran one of the most enduring empires in human history. The foundations of a bureaucratic state. The Han inherited much from the short-lived Qin dynasty, 221–206 BCE, which had famously standardized currency, weights and measures, and even the script used across China. But where Qin's brutal legalist system collapsed under its own rigidity, the Han found a more sustainable balance. Confucian ideals paired with legalist tools. This meant rules were still essential, but so was moral education, ritual, and the concept of the junzi, the cultivated gentleman. And central to this cultivation was literacy. Thus, Han governance was built upon a growing class of literate men officials trained in the five classics, tested in their knowledge of history, morality, and administration, and deployed throughout the empire to collect taxes, keep order, and send reports back to the capital. They were not warriors, they were record keepers. The working tools of empire. Early Han bureaucrats worked with bamboo strips or wooden slips, called Jian Chinese letter or Du Chinese letter, tied together with string and written upon with ink brushes. A single report might take dozens of slips, each a few centimeters wide and 20 to 40 centimeters long. Writing was vertical, in neat, compact brush strokes. Ink was made from soot and water, mixed daily on small stone pallets. Paper, as we think of it today, did not become common until around 100 CE, when a eunuch named Kai Lun is credited with improving its manufacture. His method using bark, hemp, cloth rags, and fishnets created a smoother, cheaper medium for writing. Still, even before paper's widespread use, the Han bureaucracy was flooded with information. Tax records, censuses, military rosters, crime logs, grain inventories, messages from distant provinces. Every day, carts arrived at government offices carrying bundles of reports. These were copied, summarized, passed up the chain, and eventually archived or lost, or eaten by insects, or stored in damp rooms until unreadable. The empire ran on this flow of data, and it was only as strong as the system used to keep it all from collapsing. Filing, storage, and the quiet art of administrative order. In the Han capital of Chang'an, and in provincial administrative seats, government offices were architecturally designed to house bureaucracy. Rooms with low wooden shelves, where bundles of slips were stored horizontally. Clerks assigned to specific topics: land registration, criminal justice, salt taxes, border trade. Systems of labels, often written on wood or silk, tied to each bundle. Archival staff worked to recopy fatting records, compile annual reports, and condense statistics for the court. A good administrator was not flashy. He was organized. He respected hierarchy. He ensured his documents were legible and his seals properly applied. Mistakes could lead to confusion, shortages, or worse, punishment. The Confucian scholar official was idealized not for his charisma, but for his meticulousness. His virtue was in doing his job precisely and modestly, day after day. The census and the concept of the state. The Han dynasty carried out regular censuses, with the most famous being that of 2 CE, when the population was recorded at over 59 million people, a figure not exceeded in China for nearly 2,000 years. This census was not just demographic curiosity, it was governance. Each household was recorded with names, ages, and land holdings. Based on this, grain taxes, labor obligations, and militia service were calculated. Local officials summarized results for district magistrates, who sent reports upward. The process took months, sometimes years. The accuracy varied, but it was unprecedented in scale. Behind this effort were not generals or emperors, but village-level scribes hunched over bamboo slips, visiting homes, asking questions, writing by lamplight. One historian described them as the empire's quietest voice, but the one that shaped its budget. The silent power of routine. There is something uniquely human and historically significant about a government that runs on routine and replication. The Han officials who filled out reports were not famous. Their lives were often uneventful, but they created the continuity that allowed roads to be maintained, granaries to be stocked, and justice to be dispensed. Each slip of bamboo, each sheet of paper, was part of a nervous system that let the imperial court know what was happening hundreds of miles away. And if it sounds dry, that's because it was. Boring, slow, deliberate, but vital. In an age of mounted messengers and oral traditions, the Han chose paperwork. So what happens when the volume of paper outpaces the ability to read it? What happens when an empire becomes so reliant on record-keeping that it begins to drown in its own ink? By the 1st century CE, the Han Empire was one of the largest and most densely governed civilizations in the ancient world. But its survival didn't rely on iron, horses, or bronze alone. It depended on the slow, cumulative mass of written information and the uncelebrated men who managed it. As the empire matured, the very system that gave it coherence began to swell beyond its limits. Records multiplied, forms grew more elaborate, reports became longer, more frequent, and increasingly difficult to parse. In short, Han China had begun to suffer from a problem that many modern states would one day face: bureaucratic overload. This section is about that transformation, how ink and paper shifted from tools of order to potential sources of confusion, delay, and even decay. The explosion of paperwork. After Kai Lun's refinement of paper in the early 2nd century CE, written administration accelerated. Paper was cheaper and lighter than bamboo. It could be produced in larger sheets. It allowed for quicker writing, more space for annotation, and easier duplication. As a result, more people wrote more things. Officials began issuing longer orders, supplemental notes, and even commentaries on previous documents. Where once a monthly report from a province consisted of a few dozen bamboo slips, it might now be a multi-page dossier, complete with appendices, inventories, and transcriptions of previous rulings. The imperial archives ballooned. Shelves groaned under the weight of scrolls. Storage rooms filled. Duplicates were made and sent to multiple agencies. Cross-referencing, once a rare necessity, became a common task. The bureaucracy had created its own fuel source. More documents required more clerks, which produced more documents. Clerical culture and the rise of red tape. A new kind of official began to emerge in the later Han, the specialist clerk. These were not policymakers or judges, but professional record handlers. Their work was invisible, repetitive, and highly rule-bound. Checking documents for formatting errors. Ensuring seals were correctly affixed and placed in the proper quadrant. Verifying that paper quality met imperial standards: coarse hemp paper for routine reports, finer mulberry paper for legal notices. Transcribing archived documents from worn bamboo slips into paper scrolls. Failure to comply could have consequences. The imperial system was obsessed with uniformity. We have records of officials being demoted or fined for submitting improperly formatted census rolls. One was censured because his clerk failed to align the columns of grain measurement with the imperial ruler. Others were punished for delays caused not by rebellion or incompetence, but by the sheer volume of information moving through the system. The bureaucracy, in essence, had become a machine that policed itself, often more focused on process than purpose. Provincial friction, a paper trail through the hinterlands. The bureaucratic burden was not equally shared. In remote districts, paper was harder to come by. Officials still used wood or bamboo. Communications to the capital took weeks, and delays were interpreted as negligence. Local officials often faced contradictory instructions, one order requiring tax leniency, another demanding strict collection. This created a culture of defensive administration. Officials began over-documenting, recording every decision, annotating every arrest, archiving every harvest figure not for clarity but for protection, to justify their choices, to prove they had followed orders. This was not a failure of intelligence or effort. It was a side effect of a centralized system trying to control a vast, diverse landscape through paper alone. And it bred a peculiar form of fear. To lose a document was worse than to lose a battle. The limits of legibility. One of the most striking aspects of hand bureaucracy was its preoccupation with legibility not just of characters, but of intentions. Reports were required to use standardized brushstrokes. Stylized calligraphy was discouraged in administrative texts. Even ink density mattered. Too faint, and the document could be deemed invalid. Over time, rules accumulated. Different ministries developed their own templates. Forms were duplicated, annotated, folded, sealed, and then opened again sometimes days or weeks later, their content obscured by mold, smudging, or rodent damage. In court records from the 2nd century, one dispute hinges on a misread character that led to a tax levy being mistakenly applied to the wrong household. The scribe had left too much space between strokes. The error triggered an appeal, then a reinspection, and finally a reprimand for the local official despite no malice being involved. The irony is clear. The empire that invented paper was now struggling under paper's demands. Bureaucratic ideal versus bureaucratic reality. In Confucian teaching, the ideal official was learned but modest, rigorous but compassionate, loyal to the emperor but attentive to the people. But in reality, as the paperwork mounted, officials became exhausted by filings, overwhelmed by backlogs, trapped between imperial expectation and local chaos. Letters survive from administrators begging for scribes for more paper for clarification of overlapping directives. One writes, "There are now 3 edicts concerning grain tax. They do not agree. I obeyed the first. Shall I be punished by the third?" These voices reveal something important. The machine of empire was stalling under its own instructions. The tool that had given China its edge, standardized bureaucracy, had begun to suffocate it. So how does a government recover when it has become too organized to act and too documented to adapt? Can an empire built on the flow of information survive when the channels become clogged by their own success? By the early 3rd century CE, the Han Empire was cracking, not from a sudden invasion or external threat, but from a steady internal strain. Factionalism at court, peasant rebellions, environmental disasters, and the burden of sustaining a vast, centralized bureaucracy all compounded. In the middle of it all, mostly unseen, sat the administrative engine of the empire, its gears gummed with dust, its filing shelves full. This final section explores how the bureaucratic strengths of Han China became weaknesses in its decline, and how, even as the empire fell, its commitment to record-keeping and standardized governance left a durable legacy that would echo for centuries. The final years of the Han machine. By 184 CE, the Yellow Turban Rebellion broke out, a massive peasant uprising fueled by famine, tax burden, and resentment against corrupt officials. It began in the countryside, where grain quotas had been poorly calculated and collection too rigid. The failure wasn't just agricultural, it was bureaucratic. Overwhelmed officials couldn't respond flexibly. Field agents, bound by paperwork and strict protocol, were slow to act. Messages about unrest took weeks to reach decision makers. By the time imperial forces were dispatched, hundreds of thousands had joined the revolt. This rebellion and others like it did not arise in places where war raged. They erupted where tax codes conflicted, where decrees were misinterpreted, and where too many decisions were being made by people too far away. In the capital, court politics further clogged the system. Competing factions, including powerful eunuchs and Confucian scholars, used paperwork as a weapon. Petitions were buried or lost. Critical reports were delayed. Imperial edicts were copied, reworded, and weaponized. Even the emperor could become isolated from reality, surrounded by layers of intermediaries and scribes, each managing and filtering the stream of information. It was not war that made the bureaucracy fragile. It was the inability to move fast, adapt, and see clearly through the paper. The collapse of central control. When the Han dynasty finally disintegrated in 220 CE, what collapsed was not just a monarchy, it was a system of distributed, literate order. The empire fractured into three rival kingdoms, each attempting to maintain or recreate parts of the old bureaucracy. Some succeeded briefly. Others ignored paperwork in favor of military authority. But throughout these upheavals, one truth remained. The people still expected taxes to be recorded. Local officials still wrote reports. Scribes still copied names onto household registers. The imperial structure had collapsed, but the idea that written systems were the foundation of legitimacy had survived. Even warlords legitimized their rule by invoking Han administrative practices using Han-era terms, seals, and even falsified edicts to justify their authority. The afterlife of the bureaucratic mind. In the centuries that followed, particularly during the Sui 581–618 and Tang 618–907 dynasties, China would rebuild its bureaucracy, this time on a more efficient, examination-based system. But the blueprint had already been drawn by the Han. What did Han leave behind? The principle of territorial administration, counties, commanderies, provinces. A model of bureaucratic hierarchy based on merit and loyalty. A deeply embedded culture of recording, copying, and archiving. A belief that writing orders reality, and that governing means documenting. Even the imperial examination system, which later defined Chinese civil service for over 1,000 years, had its roots in Han practices. Han scholars were already tested on the 5 classics, and those who mastered the brush were the ones promoted. The values were clear. To govern is to write. To rule is to record. To be remembered is to be filed. The quiet endurance of the clerk. If one were to visit a Han administrative center in its prime, one might not see grandeur. You would see rooms full of men bent over desks, dipping brushes into inkwells, sorting scrolls, and updating household registers. No trumpets, no parades, just the soft sound of ink on paper repeated endlessly. It's easy to dismiss these men, clerks, copyists, surveyors, as irrelevant, but they were the skeletal system of the empire. Without them, grain went uncounted, soldiers unprovisioned, and crimes unpunished. Their legacy is not just in documents preserved, but in the very idea that the pen or brush is the most powerful tool of statecraft. Their story is not dramatic, it's procedural, boring even. And yet so much of what followed in Chinese history relied on the standards they built, the characters they inked, and the files they stacked. Final reflections: what do we leave in ink? In the end, the Han bureaucracy reminds us of a larger truth. Civilizations don't just fall in battle or rise with great ideas, they survive or fail in the management of detail, in the spacing of a tax roll, in the legibility of a land deed, in the endurance of a well-kept archive. Empires may be grand in stone, but they live and die in paper. So as we scroll through files, complete forms, or file away documents, perhaps we are closer to the Han scribes than we think. We, too, build our worlds on records, on protocols, and on quiet routines that no one sees until they stop working. And when the ink dries, what is truly left behind. The modern world moves by logistics, shipping, storage, inventory, and administration. Yet this isn't a modern idea. Long before trucks rolled or spreadsheets tallied numbers, a very different world built its power on meticulous tracking, careful counting, and durable documentation. The world was Sumer in southern Mesopotamia. The time, roughly 3100 BCE. Long before empires rose in Rome or armies marched in China, the cities of Uruk, Eridu, and had already developed something extraordinary, a system of logistical control that would shape every civilization to come. They had no paper, no steel, no coinage, but they had clay, cunning, and a commitment to recording what mattered: grain, goats, labor, beer, bricks, and taxes. In this section, we explore the earliest steps humanity took to master complexity when scribes pressed wedges into wet earth, and bureaucracy was born. A civilization of storehouses. In early Sumer, political power did not emerge first from palaces or armies. It emerged from granaries. The earliest temples were not only places of worship, they were centers of economic organization. Each temple served as a kind of city-wide accounting hub. Farmers brought their surplus grain to the temple storehouses. Artisans, laborers, and priests were fed from this central supply. The result was a system based on redistribution, and it required tracking. Each offering had to be recorded. Each worker had to be compensated. Each basket of grain had to be measured. And so, the first administrators emerged not kings, but accountants, and their language was not spoken, it was impressed into clay. Cuneiform, bureaucracy in baked earth. The earliest Sumerian writing was not literature, it was logistics. Around 3300 BCE, clay tokens were used to represent goods: 1 sheep, 10 jars of oil, 100 bricks. Eventually, these tokens were pressed into clay envelopes, which were sealed, and then, to identify the contents without opening them, images were impressed on the outside. This led to proto-writing, pictographs etched into clay tablets. By 3000 BCE, these symbols had evolved into cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system that would dominate Mesopotamia for over 3,000 years. Cuneiform was difficult. It required training, patience, and practice, but it was permanent. A message on paper fades. A clay tablet baked in the sun or in the fires of a burned-down archive can survive for millennia. Many tablets we have today record nothing more exciting than 20 measures of barley distributed to the brewer on the 3rd day. 1 ox received for sacrifice. 17 workers assigned to the irrigation canal. Boring, perhaps, but essential, these were the mechanics of civilization. The scribe, master of mud. To be a scribe in Sumer was to wield power quietly. Scribes trained for years. They began as children, memorizing signs, practicing strokes, and copying phrases on clay tablets. Sumerian schools called edubas, or tablet houses, were rigorous and hierarchical. A skilled scribe could record tax obligations, write contracts, copy hymns, track temple offerings, compile legal codes. They were employed in temples, merchant houses, and royal courts. They linked the city to its resources, not through speech, but through symbols. Scribes didn't just write, they defined the terms of reality. If your name wasn't in a tablet, you didn't exist. If your transaction wasn't recorded, it had never happened. The scribe was the medium of order. Managing complexity, ziggurats, brick counts, and beer rations. As Sumerian cities expanded, so too did the complexity of their administration. Ziggurats' massive step temples required millions of mud bricks. Each batch was counted and logged. Construction workers received daily beer rations, tallied on tablets. Irrigation networks were maintained by teams of laborers, whose assignments and wages were documented. Markets flourished under the watchful eyes of inspectors who tracked weights, measures, and shipments. An example from a surviving Uruk tablet reads, 40 jugs of beer to the reed cutters, 25 loaves of barley bread, 1 overseer assigned. Not dramatic, but systematic. Without it, coordination would collapse. The greatness of Sumer did not lie only in its monuments, but in its logbooks. Shipping without ships, crates, carts, and control. One of Sumer's most remarkable feats was its ability to transport goods over distances without roads, in an era before the wheel was common. Goods were floated down the Tigris and Euphrates in reed boats. Carts, when used, were simple sledges dragged by oxen. Larger hauls were moved in crate convoys, logged and sealed. Each shipment had a tablet accompanying it, like an ancient bill of lading. Received 15 bundles of dates, carrier Enhedu, destination Nippur granary. If the crate arrived unbroken and the seal intact, all was well. If not, questions would follow. The logistics of Sumer worked not through trust, but through documentation. Reflection: what happens when civilization is built on counting? In a world where many still lived in small, unwritten cultures, the Sumerians built cities that required mathematics, inventory, and scheduled redistribution. They did not wait for kings to tell them how to rule. They created the means to do so through control of goods, not people. Theirs was an empire of clay and crates, of grain and tokens, of labor assigned and recorded. Their world may have been dusty and flat, but it was deeply structured, and it set the precedent for nearly every civilization that followed. So what happens when counting becomes more important than the thing being counted? Can a system built on ledgers, not laws, survive beyond the people who understand how to read them? By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, Sumerian cities had expanded into interlocking networks of economic cooperation and competition. The rivers linked them, the land divided them, but what bound them all together was a shared reliance on the quiet science of record-keeping. In this section, we examine how bureaucracy, once a means to manage temple stockpiles, evolved into a force that could shape the boundaries of city-states, organize foreign trade, and even justify war. It was a time when power wasn't merely about soldiers and swords, but about accountants, archives, and access to goods. The temple as central bank. In every Sumerian city, the temple complex was both a spiritual and administrative center. But over time, it evolved into something even more potent, a proto-banking institution. Farmers deposited their grain. Craftsmen received rations in barley or beer. Laborers worked on temple projects in exchange for food allocations. Scribes kept exhaustive records of who owed what and who had paid. Tablets recorded not only quantities, but types, dates, and locations. For instance, on the 12th day of the 10th month, 30 goats transferred from the herd of Lu-Enlil to the pen of the temple of Inanna. Such tablets weren't casual notes, they were binding documents. Losing one could mean losing a legal claim. Accumulating them gave an institution power. The temple thus became an accounting hub, and its storage rooms, filled with clay tablets, were the foundation of its wealth and authority. The emergence of the city-state bureaucracy. As cities like Lagash, and Umma grew, they began to formalize roles beyond the temple. City governors, ensi, acted as civil leaders. Military commanders maintained defensive walls and guards. Court officials resolved disputes. And crucially, scribes documented it all. Each level of government developed its own record-keeping system. Some cities began issuing standardized templates for various transactions effectively, the world's first bureaucratic forms. Brick production reports, distribution ledgers, tax receipts. The bureaucratic class grew. In some records, the number of scribes in a city is second only to farmers and temple workers. In a society where writing meant power, literacy became a political tool. Border disputes and the first documented war. It's in Mesopotamia that we find the first known written record of international conflict, a war between Lagash and Umma. What was it over? Water and boundaries, but more precisely, the right to claim resources, which was backed by yes documents. A boundary stone inscription, known as the Stele of the Vultures, c. 2450 BCE, tells the story. The king of Lagash, Inatum, declared that Umma had violated a border agreement, a deal likely recorded on tablets and archived. The stele includes not just images of battle, but textual references to land rights, oaths, and the obligations recorded by scribes. This was not war for expansion, it was war to enforce bureaucracy. And behind it all, scribes were tallying grain yields, labor allocations, and field boundaries, even during the conflict. Foreign trade and logistical innovation. Sumerian bureaucrats didn't just manage local resources, they connected cities to the wider world. Trade routes extended as far as the Indus Valley for carnelian and exotic woods, the Zagros Mountains for timber and metal ores, the Persian Gulf for shell and bitumen. Each shipment was documented before departure, with cargoes inventoried and transporters named. A tablet might read, 10 talents of copper from Dilmun, carried by Gautsu, approved by the governor of unloaded at the quay on the 6th day. Logistical complexity rose. Entire administrative divisions existed just to track shipments, verify weights, and resolve trade disputes. Customs inspectors emerged. Port officials developed systems of passage clearance. We even find early seals used to mark the origin or owner of goods, precursors to trademarks. Trade in ancient Mesopotamia was not ad hoc, it was institutionalized. The bureaucratic burden, when clay becomes a crutch. Of course, with complexity came a new kind of strain. Archives expanded beyond control. Duplicate records caused confusion. Conflicting entries created disputes over ownership. And with growing literacy among scribes, but not among the broader public, a gap opened. Many people could no longer verify their own rights. They had to trust the scribe or risk being erased from the record entirely. We find examples of complaints. The barley owed to me was recorded, but the scribe has changed the sign. I demand correction. Such protests underscore the fragility of a system built on clay, permanent in one sense, but dependent on human honesty and legibility. Without transparency, bureaucracy can become not a tool for order, but a gatekeeper of it. Scaling an administrative world. Still, even with its flaws, the Mesopotamian logistical system endured and evolved. By the time of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon the Great, c. 2334 BCE, a more centralized model emerged. Bureaucrats now operated across regions, reporting to the capital. Uniform systems were introduced. A standard calendar for administrative use. Uniform measures of weight and volume. Scribes rotated between cities to reduce local bias. All of these changes suggest that Mesopotamian rulers understood a deep truth. A civilization can only grow as far as its administrative infrastructure allows. The Akkadians inherited more than land. They inherited a way of thinking about systems and turned it into policy. Unanswered order, what happens when the clerks rule? As Sumer gave way to Akkad, and later Babylonia, the system of clay tablets, scribal power, and logistical order continued, but at increasing scale and abstraction. The scribe was no longer just a record keeper. He was a judge, a planner, a tool of the state. Yet one has to wonder, if every good, every person, every field is reduced to a line in a ledger, what happens to the human behind the number? Does bureaucracy empower society or depersonalize it? Is the world made safer by meticulous record-keeping, or more vulnerable when those records are lost, corrupted, or weaponized? And if the clay tablets crumble, does the civilization disappear with them? By the dawn of the second millennium BCE, the great cities of Sumer were fading into history. New powers Babylon, Assyria, and Elam rose in their place. But even as the political map changed, the administrative DNA of Sumer endured. Its influence continued not through kings, but through protocols, procedures, and a civilization built around the act of recording. This final section follows the waning days of Sumerian logistics, explores how the system ultimately collapsed, and reflects on the surprising endurance of a bureaucratic worldview that still echoes in modern institutions. Collapse from within, the weight of the tablet. Despite its ingenuity, the Sumerian logistical system began to show signs of exhaustion. The clay tablets that once ensured clarity became, over time, a burden. Cities accumulated tens of thousands of tablets, with few systems for indexing. Storage spaces filled. Important documents were buried beneath obsolete records. Duplicates conflicted. Some were altered over time intentionally or otherwise. One archive at Nippur contained over 20,000 tablets, many unreadable due to mold, rodent damage, or simply decay of script conventions over time. Clerks could not always decipher older entries. Overlapping systems, inconsistent calendars, and changing measures led to disputes. The very precision that had once defined Sumer became a source of bureaucratic paralysis. Even powerful rulers like Ur-Nammu, c. 2100 BCE, who codified one of the earliest known legal systems, struggled to govern through paperwork alone. His laws were clear, but their enforcement relied on overburdened scribes and fragmented city-states. In time, some transactions ceased to be recorded, at all a quiet administrative death. The fall of Ur and the end of a system. The final blow came around 2004 BCE, when the city of Ur, capital of the last great Sumerian dynasty, was sacked by the Elamites. Archaeologists discovered scorched archives, broken tablets, and collapsed storerooms beneath the ruins. Yet even in these last days, scribes were still filing reports. On the 17th day, the city gate was closed, the watch doubled, temple supplies accounted, treasury sealed. The end did not come with silence, but with over-documentation, an empire writing itself into oblivion. It's a haunting reminder. No matter how advanced a bureaucratic system becomes, it cannot defend against the forces it was never designed to withstand: foreign invasion, famine, climate shifts, or the slow erosion of civic cooperation. What was preserved and why it mattered? Despite collapse, the legacy of Sumerian logistics persisted. The Babylonians adopted the cuneiform script and maintained clay archives. The Assyrians improved upon Sumer's system, centralizing storage in palace libraries. Even Persian and Hellenistic administrators centuries later would echo the practice of systematic inventories, receipts, and resource tracking. Sumer had created something greater than a city or a dynasty. It had built a template for record-based governance. Modern historians can trace practices like receipt systems, notarized transactions, ledger-based accounting, ration distribution linked to labor units, all the way back to Sumer. Even modern words like office, register, and archive are conceptual descendants of Sumerian spaces where grain, goats, and people were logged, counted, and stored. The scribe's immortality. Ironically, Sumerian scribes who never sought fame are among the best-remembered individuals of their time. Their names, scratched into tablets as part of routine entries, still survive. Ur-Niger, scribe of barley disbursement, month 7, year of the High Canal. Amr-Sin, apprentice of the tablet house, recorded the cargo at sunset. These were not epics, they were notes, slips, confirmations, but because they were baked, buried, and forgotten, they are preserved. Through them, we see a civilization not of warriors or poets, but of logisticians. And we must ask, in a world where data is now digital, where receipts vanish into inboxes and archives float on servers, will any of it last 5,000 years? Reflections, the first system thinkers. The Sumerians were not inventors of machines, they were inventors of process. They created not just objects, but systems to manage objects. A place for everything, a time for everything, a tablet for everything. And in doing so, they asked questions that remain with us. Who owns what? Who owes what? What is fair? What is due? How do we know? They may not have had electricity, engines, or computers, but in their commitment to organizing the chaos of human life, they became the first system thinkers. Their temples were our spreadsheets. Their clay tablets were our databases. Their crates were our shipping ledgers. And so the boring, brilliant world of Sumerian logistics shaped not just how we trade, but how we think. When the last crate is opened and the final tablet read, what will our systems say about us?